The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my guests, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Scott Gershwer, and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel is once again answering questions from our listeners. We have a question from Kathleen, who hails from Chicago, Illinois. Kathleen asks, I want to hear people's thoughts on the issues rather than on the candidate. We are being told the main issues for Americans are the economy, immigration, and abortion. Does the panel agree that these three are the real issues Americans are most concerned about? Scott says the economy is great and the immigration crisis is under control. Mark, on the other hand, focuses more on the global issues facing the U.S. and on political ideology. If Scott is correct, then why is this such a concern for Americans? If Mark is focused on the correct issues, why aren't more Americans also focused on these issues? And finally, when will Priscilla be back? And we know that Priscilla is back. Welcome back, Priscilla. So, who would like to take this first?
I'm just amazed that Priscilla got mentioned and she had a hiatus and me and Scott got called out. That's pretty rough, Scott. I mean, that's kind of rough.
I don't like getting called out.
Yeah, we're getting called out.
Person from Chicago. I'm an idiot, and there's no reason why you should even be listening to a word I say.
Well, the economy, and most people don't understand the way the government works, let alone the economy. People actually, and Scott's made this mention before, that the president has some sort of a dial on his desk where he dials up the price of eggs and butter and gas and all. That's not the way it actually works. So, yeah, it's a concern. The increase in wages has outpaced inflation. I think it's a manufacturer. People that are really concerned about the economy are concerned simply because somebody, Fox News, told them to be. Same thing with the million-man caravan that was coming across the border that never showed up. I mean, where do they all go? Immigration is an issue that is an issue of the Congress more than it is of the president. And there is a bill, bipartisan, with everything the Republicans want. You could have had it enacted 4 months ago, but unfortunately, somebody, Donald Trump, talked them into not passing it through. So if you're concerned about all this stuff, you're concerned for all the wrong reasons. Do I take a look at this as more of a global and political ideology? Yeah, I do. That's my area, global issues and political ideology. They both speak to, especially the political ideology, why the concern is for the economy and for immigration, because the political ideology in many cases is not about what the Americans actually think. It's about what they're being told. And there's a huge difference there. If you're being told something that's incorrect and you just blindly believe it, there really isn't much we can do about that.
To emphasize a point that you make, right-wing media is very powerful. We've discussed this before. If they don't want you to be happy about the economy, they're going to make sure that you're not happy about the economy. People who get their news from Fox know less than people who get no news at all. And most people in America get their news from Fox. It is an enormous problem for which there is no solution other than Fox just voluntarily changes their behavior. Let me then go to how you know the economy is good. There are what's known as indicators, key performance indicators of the economy. We don't measure them all the same. They're not all as important as others. GDP, unemployment, inflation, price levels, which is different from inflation. Housing starts is another economic indicator. Balance of trade is another economic indicator. There are a whole bunch of economic indicators that you can look at, and you can get these stats very simply going on Google and Googling economic indicators and finding out what they are and where they are. What you'll discover is that we're doing really, really well in America. Now, price levels are up. And there are a bunch of different reasons for that. They're not always all under the control of the U.S. president, but they do move up and down. Prices, I said a couple of weeks ago, we don't want deflation. That's usually a really bad sign of a bad economy. You don't want prices to drop down too low when there are surpluses of things, prices tend to go down unless somebody admits in a congressional hearing or a federal court that they are, in fact, boosting prices above the level of inflation, which was recently done by an executive at Kroger Supermarkets in the trial over whether they can buy Albertsons supermarkets and create even more of a monopoly than they have right now. Said, we have raised prices above the level of inflation. If you're a nerd like me and you sit there listening to Bloomberg all day and you hear one CEO and CFO do earnings reporting and they say the words, as I have so often heard over the last 2 years, our aggressive pricing strategy has led us to the highest profits we've ever had. That's a good sign that people are gouging on you, and something does need to be done about that. And there is a role for the government to play in that. Just one last thing, and then I'll stop on the economy. Goldman Sachs, perhaps the exemplar of capitalism in the world, came out with a statement today that says that the best economic growth for the United States would come from Kamala Harris winning the White House and Democrats winning both houses of Congress in November's election. That's Goldman Sachs saying that. Goldman Sachs is saying that a divided government led by Donald Trump would be an economic disaster, mostly due to increased tariffs on imports and tighter immigration policies. So the best thing that you can do if you care about the economy of the United States of America is to vote blue.
Well, on that, I would say the average voter probably doesn't actually care about the economy. I think the economy has been made into a buzzword, much like Mark was saying. You know, if the news and media are telling you to be worried about the economy, you're going to be worried about the economy. What average voter, I think, really cares about is whether or not they can pay their rent at the end of the month, whether or not they can afford gas to get to work, whether or not they have any kind of padding in case they have an emergency, like with their car or within their home, whether or not they can afford to get their children school supplies or feed them, things like that. When people live in a space where they continually see a cycle of struggle to meet those basic needs, and people are saying we have an economy problem, that gets internalized as we have an economy problem, right? That means that something is clearly wrong and we need to vote for the candidate who's going to fix the economy. I don't think they even know what the economy truly means. Now, I think that they're thinking to the big question about the issues. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is what are the things that people, like, what are those issues that they actually care about? Economics, immigration, abortion have been the buzzwords for every election, at least as long as I've been alive, possibly longer, I'm assuming. I don't know. I wasn't there. But if you were to ask the people I know, my circle of friends, we're all going to say we care about student loan forgiveness and we care about making sure our women and queer friends and people, friends of color, have a life to look forward to and have equal opportunity. That's not directly economics and abortion. That's just a facet of that because of the way that those things impact us on a day-to-day. We see the day-to-day effects. We don't see the day-to-day effect when we keep it high level and broad and conceptual.
I have one further question. In at least some states, with Republican governors, the federal government had offered money for families who fell below a certain level of income to have food for their children, additional support, I don't know, with SNAP benefits, whatever it might be, over the summer, so they could feed their children and they would not have to worry about grocery costs. And these governors in at least some red states or all red states, I'm not sure, had turned down the federal money. This was not federal money that had any additional, you must do this or we won't give you the federal funds. It was simply, here's federal funds to give to families who need help feeding their children. And the governors had refused. Then,
that's accurate.
Okay.
But there was a cost associated to it. And the cost was they had to provide the administrative money to be able to run the program.
Right. A couple of $100,000.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking, the government was not going to pay for the administrative costs of doing this. The state would have to pay for it. And that was the governor's argument. Well, we don't want to do that.
But then
it was 14 states, by the way.
14. So then those
and they turned down $480 million or something like that, $40 a child for this benefit. And they turned it down because they like starving children in their states. Yeah, it's beyond. Like my daughter was a school teacher. She asked one of her students what he was going to do over their vacation, and he said, "Look for food." I mean, this is a fifth grader saying, "I'm going to spend my time looking for food." She said she just put her head down on the desk and tried not to cry.
I think it's really important, though, because Scott, you said this, is that the governors, as of right now, have a lot of power over the state. The governors who seem to be the most supportive of starving children rather than, feeding the starving children are the ones who are part of the anti-federal government caucus. So it's not even so much that they want to see starving children. I mean, maybe they do, but that they don't want the money coming from the federal government. However, they're also not willing to allocate state resources to get there. So there's this really odd push and pull that seems to happen between we don't want federal government because federal government bad, but we don't want to allocate state resources because we don't have the state resources. You can't have it both ways. So that's where these states keep falling into this push and pull between what the governors are doing and what their constituents say they want.
The mechanism for this was a debit card that would go to the families, and so the families could go to the supermarket and buy food for their children. In almost all of these Republican-led states that turned down that card, the reason that they turned down the card was not so much the administrative cost of running the program, because it was fairly minimal, but because they were worried that these parents would be taking these cards and going to liquor stores and buying liquor or buying food for adults. You always hear the people on Fox talking about how much shrimp people are buying and how dare they, when their children are starving and they're going out and buying shrimp and lobster or whatever it is that they think they're buying. And when Joe Manchin, who was one of the people who turned down the extended tax credit for children that took 40 million people or something like children out of poverty, when he turned it down, he said specifically in his state that when he was governor, people would use the money that they got to offset their own liquor purchases or drug purchases. And so social scientists went to West Virginia to examine how people actually did use that money. And it turned out that they used that money for food for their children, or in some cases, some school supplies or clothing for their children. And they went back and reported that to him, and it still didn't change his mind. I would say the two biggest obsessions in America, and I'm going to make it three. One, women using abortion as birth control. Two, people using government funding to fund their alcohol and drug habits rather than feeding their families. And then three, voter fraud, which is almost non-existent and causes Republicans mostly in red states to go berserk over making sure that people can't vote. Like you hear about Zucker bucks and things like that are no longer coming. And you know what Zucker bucks were made for? They had to buy pens to fill out the bubble sheet that they used to vote in some places, because in some areas where minorities tend to vote Democratic, they would only have one working pen in the voting facility, so that people had to wait online to get access to that one working pen or pencil to fill in the bubble to put the slip into the voting machine and count their votes. And they wanted to do away with that because it gave an unfair advantage to Democrats if there aren't long lines that discourage people from voting. Those are the three main obsessions, I think, that are going on in Republican minds these days. Frankly, I think it's a pretty horrible thing.
And the power of propaganda is strong. Anytime those narratives are reinforced by the politicians, by the media, by church leaders, by whomever, right? It sticks. And so, the welfare queen has been a thing now since Reagan and is not a thing, but it's so pervasive. Like no one can get rid of this image of the welfare queen, and it taints every perspective when it comes to understanding the value of what welfare is, never mind the nuances of it. It's like you can't just walk up to the welfare office and say, give me free money. You have to qualify for it. In order to qualify for it, you have to provide documentation. If you can't provide documentation, you're not going to get the welfare. And once you get in there, they have a whole metric of what they do based on your income, based on your family size, based on what community you're in, and they allocate your benefits accordingly. Those benefits may just include a small percentage of food stamps to help augment what you have, or it could actually be something more broad spectrum. It's case by case. You also aren't eligible for welfare benefits if you are an undocumented immigrant. I don't think documented immigrants are allowed either. I think you have to be green card. So folks aren't getting benefits they aren't due. You still have to, because you have to prove your income, you're still paying taxes of some sort because you have to prove the income. You're not going to, if you take a cash only position, you have no proof, right? So there's so many layers and it's so complex. People who haven't lived through that experience don't understand it. I've had conversations with people when they're, facing unemployment. I'm like, go get unemployment benefits. And they're like, oh no, I can't do that. And I'm like, it's your right as somebody who's paid taxes, go get your unemployment benefits and or disability benefits or any of these things that are benefits that, the Republican Party would like to get rid of. But those are all there for a reason. But you can't just walk up and say, I'm taking this. It doesn't work that way. You can get a gun easier than you can get welfare.
Yes. So to Kathleen, what I would say is it goes back to my area. It's political. If you want to know what we should be concerned about, political ideology. That is the thing. The economy, people don't understand. Immigration is not what you're being told. Abortion is a very small issue as it relates to overall women's health. But it's the political ideology that drives our nation today. And that is the thing that we should truly be most concerned about.
Thank you all. And thank you, Kathleen, for your questions. We'll see you next time.
So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, the Journal of Interdisciplinary Conflict Science. The JCIS is an open journal for upcoming scholars. The JCIS is currently accepting article submissions on an ongoing basis. The JCIS is a publication of Nova Works, a scholarly depository at Nova Southeastern University. A link to the journal is in our description. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, who is our editing partner, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. We'd also like to thank iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all these and other quality platforms mentioned in our description. We'd also like to thank our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, a question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.